At age 57, Shannon Sharpe stands in NFL history as a benchmark that very few tight ends have ever reached, not through inflated hype, but through rock-solid, undeniable achievements. He is the one who changed how the entire league viewed the tight end position, transforming it from a quiet supporting role into a legitimate offensive weapon. 3 Super Bowl championships, 2 with the Denver Broncos and 1 with the Baltimore Ravens, were not just titles. They were the mark of a player who was always present in the highest pressure moments. 8 Pro Bowl selections, 4 first-team All-Pro honors, and for many years holding NFL records for receptions, yards, and touchdowns by a tight end, Shannon Sharpe didn't just play at the top. He stayed there long enough to redefine the standard of greatness. When he was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2011, his name didn't represent one outstanding season or a short explosive period, but an entire career built on resilience, physical contact, and iron discipline. Even after retirement, he remains a presence in American sports life as a sharp, straightforward, no-compromise commentator, continuing to hold his position as a voice that doesn't shy away from the truth, even when it makes him uncomfortable in many people's eyes. But behind those glittering records is another life, one without cheering crowds or titles to lean on. The body that once helped him dominate the field now wakes up every day with pain that arrives before consciousness, a cold reminder that every victory was paid for with joints and endurance. Shannon Sharpe doesn't collapse under that pain, but he doesn't romanticize it either. The willpower that once helped him survive thousands of collisions is now used to negotiate with his own body, to get up when every joint protests, to keep showing up in public with nothing left to shield him but old discipline. He no longer competes, no longer has to prove he belongs on the roster, but he still lives like an athlete, because he knows that if he lets go, the price will come immediately. The pain doesn't turn him into a victim, nor does it turn him into a tragic symbol. It simply becomes an inseparable part of who he is. Shannon Sharpe doesn't defeat the pain. He learns to carry it, quietly and persistently, just as he carried his entire career through the NFL. And it is in that unshowy endurance that his tragedy and his dignity exist side by side, inseparable. If you want to keep following the story behind Shannon Sharpe's spotlight, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters. Born in Glennville, Georgia, Shannon Sharpe didn't enter life with a tragedy dramatic enough to make others pause in pity, but he grew up in circumstances lacking nearly everything a child needs to feel protected. Glennville was a small, poor town where red dust roads stretched past low houses, where life moved slow and heavy, like the humid southern air itself. There, people weren't used to talking much about feelings, nor showing love through hugs. Everything was measured by whether you could stand firm through today, not by whether you felt loved. Shannon grew up in that silence, a silence not loud but persistent, seeping into every meal, every morning waking up, every night going to bed without anyone asking what the boy was thinking or afraid of. With no father present in the home to create a sense of safety or a figure to hold on to, Shannon's life was early shaped by absence. That absence wasn't named or explained. It just existed, like an obvious fact he had to accept. Shannon's mother wasn't a cold woman, but she was tired. Tired in the way of a woman carrying an entire family on her shoulders under conditions of scarcity, and that exhaustion often left no room for tenderness. Rare hugs, almost non-existent words of comfort, not because she didn't love her son, but because she no longer had the strength to show it. In that house, emotions weren't prioritized. Survival was what mattered. Shannon learned that very early. He learned to observe more than speak, to handle his own sadness in silence, to not burden others with personal needs. While other children could cry for attention, Shannon understood that tears brought nothing but a sense of weakness he wasn't allowed to show. He didn't demand, because demanding often led to disappointment. He didn't complain, because complaining didn't change reality. And he didn't expect anyone to come rescue him, because in his world, no one was promised to show up on time. Glennville didn't teach Shannon how to dream. It taught him how to endure. The days passed evenly, without big events to mark them. But that very evenness was what wore a child down. No explosive moments of suffering, just the simmering feeling that he had to take care of himself. That weakness was a luxury. Shannon grew up in that context, where quiet existence was seen as a virtue, where expressing emotions wasn't encouraged, and where a boy learned that the best way not to get hurt was to expect nothing from anyone. Shannon Sharpe's original tragedy wasn't in dramatic blows or losses, but in the fact that he was never safely allowed to be weak. No one told him he had the right to be afraid, the right to be tired, the right to be comforted. And when a child isn't allowed to be weak, he grows into a man who doesn't know how to let himself down, doesn't know how to ask for help, and doesn't believe the world will go easy on him if he slows down. It was in the silence of Glennville, in the rooms lacking words and the meals lacking warmth, that Shannon Sharpe learned the first lesson of his life. To survive, you must first be tough, and if it hurts, you carry it yourself, without letting anyone see, without letting anyone hear. In the small house in Glennville, where silence had become habit and expectations were conveyed more through looks than words, Sterling Sharpe appeared as something completely different. Sterling wasn't just the older brother. He was a rare light in a space that otherwise lacked hope, the child who made everyone believe this family finally had something to be proud of. Sterling's talent showed early, clearly, and without explanation he ran faster, caught balls more naturally, and every time he stepped on the field he drew eyes. Coaches believed in him, friends admired him, and the family followed him with hope they had never placed on Shannon's shoulders. In that context, Shannon Sharpe grew up not in open competition, but in a quiet yet persistent comparison, where every effort he made was measured against a preset standard named after his brother. Shannon stood behind, not because he lacked effort, but because Sterling's light was so bright that its shadow covered everything nearby. He quietly watched every step his brother took, every compliment Sterling received, every trusting look the adults gave him. And in that quiet, Shannon began to understand a painful truth. In this family, some people were expected to shine, and some were only expected not to make things worse. No one said it out loud, but Shannon felt it in every meal, in every conversation revolving around Sterling's achievements, in the way people spoke of the future with certainty about his brother and vagueness about him. Shannon loved his brother, loved in the way a younger sibling always feels proud, seeing his older brother recognized. But that love came with a simmering fear he never dared admit. The fear that he would forever be just Sterling Sharpe's little brother, the fear that no matter how great his efforts, they would only be seen as a faint copy of something already perfect. That unspoken comparison began to sink deep into Shannon's mind, not as anger, but as a hard-to-name sense of lack. He didn't envy in the usual sense, didn't resent his brother because Sterling had never done anything wrong, but he gradually formed a question that repeated in his head. If the light was already given to him, then what am I here for? In the family, Sterling was the clear hope, while Shannon was the silent presence, always trying not to add burden, not to demand attention, not to disrupt the established order. He learned to step back, to accept second place as a given. But deep inside, every time he was called by the name tied to his brother, every time he was referred to as Sterling's little brother, a part of him shrank, as if he were slowly disappearing behind that label. Shannon's wound didn't come from direct harshness, but from being constantly placed in a comparison where he could never win. It was in that family environment, where love existed alongside a hierarchy of expectations, that Shannon Sharpe began to form a lifelong conflict, both yearning to be like his brother and fearing that if he remained only his shadow, he would never have the chance to become himself. Leaving Glennville to step into Savannah State University, Shannon Sharpe didn't feel like he was getting any closer to the light. It was more like he had just taken another step, deeper into the edge of the American sports map. Savannah State wasn't a place people went to find legends, not a stage for names already penciled into scouts' notebooks, and certainly not a spot where TV cameras lined up waiting to capture the birth of a star. There were no cameras following every practice, no big-name college coaches standing on the sideline with big promises, no roaring crowds making a young player believe he was on the right path. If anything, there were only sparse bleachers, scorching afternoon sun, and the feeling that every effort was happening in a space very few people cared about. Shannon entered that environment with his familiar baggage: silence, endurance, and discipline. But this time, the silence was no longer a defensive choice. It became the all-encompassing backdrop, making every passing day carry a quiet question about the meaning of his existence. No one called his name as a prospect. No one whispered that this was someone to watch. No one lingered more than a few seconds to watch Shannon practice and jot down something valuable. Practices happened as if just to fulfill an obligation, and games ended without any echo reaching beyond the campus. In the world of college football, where attention is currency and eyes are promises for the future, Shannon Sharpe was playing in near invisibility. He began to understand a bitter truth very few young players are ready to face. Talent doesn't automatically get seen, and effort doesn't guarantee recognition. Every route he ran, every ball he caught, every hit he took, he gave everything he had. But when he looked up at the stands, all that reflected back was empty rows and prolonged indifference. No applause to keep his heart beating, no excited eyes to confirm he was doing something right. Shannon started living with the feeling that if he didn't show up on the field today, if he got injured tomorrow or disappeared from the lineup, it was very likely no one would even ask why. That invisibility didn't happen in a single moment. It stretched out, day after day, week after week, gradually wearing down the self-worth of a boy already used to standing behind someone else's light. At Savannah State, Shannon didn't just learn how to play football. He learned how to exist without being acknowledged, how to keep working when the only reward was silence. Those nights returning to his room, body exhausted after practice, he wondered if this path led anywhere at all, or if it was just another loop of trying in obscurity. But quitting was never a clear option, because from childhood, Shannon had learned that no one comes to save you if you stop. Instead, he tightened his discipline, trained harder, was stricter with himself, not because he believed someone was watching, but because he feared that if he let go, the invisibility would swallow him whole. Savannah State became a different kind of school, not listed in any curriculum, where Shannon Sharpe learned the painful lesson about the world he was entering. This world has no obligation to see you, and if you aren't tough enough to survive in the dark, you'll be erased without a trace. It was in that unwatched environment, where every day felt like a test of faith, that Shannon began to understand the road ahead wouldn't be paved with attention or favoritism. If there was an exit for him, it would have to be dug out by his own hands, in silence, in sweat, and in the feeling that he was fighting a world that had never acknowledged his presence. The draft day arrived without fireworks or glittering promises. It came quietly, just as the football world had always treated Shannon Sharpe up to that point. No crowded war room surrounding him, no cameras glued to his every breath, no family moment holding its breath, waiting for his name to be called early. If anything, there were only the long rounds dragging on, name after name called, fragile hope after fragile hope slipping away, and Shannon sitting there, silent, familiar with the feeling of being left behind. The first round passed like a confirmation that he wasn't part of the story written for those destined for the spotlight. The second round deepened the silence. The third, fourth, fifth, each time another name was read. Reality reminded him he was on the edge of every big plan. By the seventh round, when public attention had already cooled, when teams were only looking for stopgap roster fixes, Shannon Sharpe's name was finally called not as an eagerly awaited discovery, but as the last piece to fill a leftover spot. A seventh-round draft pick didn't come with full joy. It carried an unspoken message that anyone who's been in that position understands clearly. You weren't chosen to become an icon. You were chosen because no one else fit better at that moment. No long-term commitment, no significant investment, no built-in patience for mistakes, just a fragile opportunity and a wordless reminder that you could be replaced at any time. For Shannon, that moment wasn't the start of a dream. It was the first cut into his professional dignity, a cut that didn't bleed, but hurt in a slow, lingering way. It told him that all those silent years at Savannah State, all the sweat and discipline, all the unwatched practices, were only enough to get him to the lowest threshold of the highest league, and nothing more. In the NFL world, the draft isn't just a selection event, it's a classification sentence, where they decide who deserves to be waited on and who only deserves to be tested. Shannon understood his place in that sentence very clearly. He didn't enter the league as an asset to be protected, but as a tool that could be used and discarded. That truth wasn't spoken, but it was present in every small detail. Short-term contract, skeptical looks from coaches, shaky spot on the depth chart. Every practice became an endless audition. Every mistake, no matter how small, could be reason enough to be crossed off. For a young player, that didn't just test the body. It eroded self-respect, because it's very hard to believe in your own value when the entire system around you treats you like a backup plan. Shannon didn't protest out loud, didn't allow himself to complain, because from Glennville to Savannah State, he had learned that complaining doesn't change your position. Instead, he swallowed that feeling of being diminished whole, turning it into a heavy silence that weighed on every route he ran, every block he made, every catch he hauled in. The seventh-round draft didn't kill Shannon Sharpe's dream, but it twisted the way he saw himself, forcing him to confront a brutal reality. In this league's eyes, he wasn't chosen to shine. He was chosen to prove every single day that he deserved to exist. And it was from that quiet cut, from the feeling of being seen as a placeholder, that Shannon began carrying an obsession that would follow him throughout his career. If I don't make myself irreplaceable, this world won't hesitate to erase my name from the list. When he stepped into the Denver Broncos locker room, Shannon Sharpe understood very clearly that a seventh-round draft pick gave him no special privileges to learn slowly or develop on a patient timeline. In this place, no one waited for him to grow up. No one was patient with mistakes, and no one cared about the story he had gone through to get here. He didn't enter the NFL as a long-term project, but as a body that could be used for as long as it held up when it broke. Replace it. It was in that context that Shannon began making a choice he would carry with him for the rest of his life. If no one saw him as an asset, then he would turn his own body into undeniable proof. Pain started to be used as capital. Shannon trained more than was safe not because anyone demanded it, but because the fear of being pushed aside was always present. When practice ended, he stayed longer, ran more, lifted more, pushed his body beyond the limits it was signaling to stop. In a league where size and strength were the common language, Shannon understood that effort alone wasn't enough. He had to be tougher than necessary, had to hit as if every play was a survival interview. Every day on the practice field wasn't just preparation for the game. It was a test of his right to exist, where he had to prove he wasn't the name easily crossed off when space was needed for someone else. Trash talk, which later became Shannon Sharpe's signature, didn't come from arrogance or a love of confrontation, but from a much deeper need, the need to be seen. In an environment where he wasn't defaulted as important, words became the way to force others to pay attention, to react, to acknowledge that he was here and not easy to ignore. Every taunt wasn't just meant to throw off an opponent. It was also an affirmation to himself that he was no longer the invisible kid at Savannah State, or the backup plan on the draft board. On the field, Shannon threw himself into collisions with near-reckless determination, because every time his body absorbed another hit, another pull, another midfield collision, it was one more time he told himself he deserved to stay. But that acknowledgement never came free. Shannon's body began recording every impact, every hard landing, every moment he forced himself to get up faster, so no sign of weakness showed. In the NFL, weakness wasn't just a physical state. It was a dangerous message that could end a career before it really started. Shannon understood that too well, so he allowed no gaps to appear. He gritted his teeth through pain no one asked him to endure, because in his mind, every time he endured pain was one more purchase of time to exist. That toughness quickly turned Shannon into a reliable player in the eyes of teammates and coaches, but the price was the quiet erosion of his own body. There was no moment to stop and wonder if this approach was sustainable, because a seventh-round pick didn't grant him the luxury of long-term reflection. Every game was a test, every week an elimination round, and just one beat of slowing down could push him back to the edge he had just escaped. Shannon turned himself into the guy always ready for the toughest situations, the plays others avoided, because that was the only way to become irreplaceable. But when a person has to constantly prove their value with their body, that body sooner or later becomes the bearer of all the pressure. Mornings waking up with stiffness in the back, nagging pain in the knees, bruises that hadn't healed before, new ones layered over them, Shannon saw all of it as the inevitable part of the job. He didn't call it sacrifice, didn't allow himself to see it as tragedy, because admitting that would mean questioning the path he had chosen. Instead, he kept charging in, kept using pain as a unit of measurement for his own commitment. Every collision on the field wasn't just a play, it was a silent declaration to the entire league. I'm not here to fill a gap. I'm here because I can take what others can't. But it was in that very intensity that the tragedy began to form. Shannon's body was no longer just a means to play football. It became a tool of proof, and when a person turns their body into a tool, they rarely stop at the right time. Every bit of recognition, every rare compliment, only reinforced the belief that pain was the right path, that the more he endured, the more he deserved to stay. Few realized that the acknowledgement Shannon was buying with his body only held value in the moment, while the real cost would be paid later when the sounds of impact faded and adrenaline was no longer strong enough to mask the consequences. But at that point, in the Broncos' colors and in a league that waited for no one, Shannon Sharpe had no luxury to think about the future. The only thing that mattered was today. He had to prove he deserved it, and if necessary, he was willing to pay with his own body, one collision at a time, one day at a time. Glory came to Shannon Sharpe, not through graceful runs or long rounds of applause, but through the pounding heartbeats of big games where every mistake could erase an entire season's work. When the first Super Bowl trophies appeared in his career, they carried the feeling of victory any player dreams of, but they brought no comfort. On the stage of decisive moments, Shannon was the embodiment of absolute reliability, running routes at the perfect time, catching balls in tight windows, absorbing hits from heavier bodies, and getting up as if nothing had happened. The Pro Bowl calls, the stats, climbing historical leaderboards for tight ends, all of it confirmed he was no longer a placeholder. He had become an indispensable part of the team's winning structure, a name teammates leaned on in the tensest moments. But at the same time, an unspoken rule was etched deeper than ever. Pain was not allowed to be spoken, and weakness was not allowed to be admitted. In a locker room full of men who lived by contact, admitting pain meant putting a question mark over your ability to play next week. Shannon understood that clearly, so he stayed silent, carrying the nagging pain from one game to the next, from one season to the next. When the numbers were read to the media, no one mentioned the mornings he needed more time to get up, or the nights he had to ice in silence so his body could recover for the next day. On paper, his career was soaring, but inside, the fatigue was building with no outlet. Shannon won games, won titles, won the league's recognition, but he had no place to unload the exhaustion. No safe space to say his body was fighting back, that every landing left a longer echo than before. Instead, he kept putting on the uniform, kept taking the field with the same intensity, because glory in the NFL always has a short shelf life, and just one beat of slowing down meant you'd be replaced. The celebration moments after victories passed quickly, giving way to the next brutal training schedule, to tighter tape around the knees, to painkillers becoming a familiar part of the pregame routine. Shannon Sharpe didn't allow himself to enjoy victory the way outsiders imagined, because enjoying meant letting go, and letting go in this world was an unacceptable risk. When the media praised him as one of the best tight ends, he listened but didn't let the words sink too deep, because he knew today's praise could turn to doubt after just one injury. The historical numbers brought status, but no relief. Instead, they placed a new pressure on his shoulders, maintain the standard he himself had created, even as his body paid a higher and higher price. In the rare moments alone, Shannon felt the clear gap between the unbreakable warrior image the public saw and the person quietly enduring behind it. He never allowed that gap to show, because from his days as a seventh-round choice, he had learned that weakness didn't bring more chances. It only made others look for replacements. So the first glory for Shannon Sharpe wasn't the end of doubt. It was the beginning of a new phase, where victory came hand in hand with his body being locked into a single role, always ready, always able to endure, always silent. The trophies, the honors, the historical stat pages, all of it confirmed he had reached the peak, but they didn't soothe the truth that every step forward was paid with a piece of strength that would never return. And in that silence, amid the roar of the crowds and the lights of glorious nights, Shannon Sharpe kept moving forward, carrying the unnamed exhaustion, because in the world he lived in, victory was mandatory and comfort was a luxury. The moment Sterling Sharpe stopped didn't come with the final whistle or a prepared farewell ceremony. It came the way real tragedies in this family usually do, quietly, unexpectedly, and without giving anyone time to brace themselves. A neck injury on the surface, it sounded like a short medical report, but for Sterling, it was the end of everything he had built with talent and effort. No more field, no more familiar rhythm of practices, no more future already sketched out with upcoming seasons. His career ended not because of a lack of ability, but because his body betrayed him in the cruelest way. For the Sharpe family, the news didn't create loud scenes of sorrow. It created a void. Silence enveloped the house, a silence heavier than any weeping, because no one knew what to say when the worst had happened without a clear person to blame. Sterling, the brother who had once been the light, was suddenly forced to stand on the sidelines, watching the football world keep spinning without a place for him anymore. Meanwhile, Shannon Sharpe wasn't allowed to stop. The schedule didn't change, the locker room stayed open every week, and his name still appeared in the starting lineup. Shannon kept taking the field, kept running routes, kept scoring, kept doing what he had trained his whole life to do. But from the moment Sterling stopped, every step Shannon took carried a new weight. He was no longer playing just for himself. He was playing in the shadow of an unspoken question. Why did he get to keep going while his brother didn't? The silence in the family became a dark backdrop, seeping into every brief conversation, every averted glance, every time Sterling's name was mentioned and then quickly dropped. Shannon didn't know who to share his victories with, because every time he received glory, every time the media called him one of the best tight ends, He was aware that someone in the family was living the exact opposite reality. Sterling didn't envy, didn't resent, but his silent presence made every joy feel restrained. Shannon began living with a nameless guilt, a feeling that couldn't quite be called shame, but also couldn't be called full pride. He kept living, kept winning games, kept receiving praise, but deep inside, a part of him wondered if he even had the right to do so. Every time he took the field after Sterling had been forced to stop, Shannon felt like he was carrying an unresolved story, an injustice he hadn't caused but had unintentionally inherited. He couldn't quit to share the pain with his brother, because quitting would mean betraying everything he had endured to get here. But he also couldn't fully enjoy victory without feeling a lingering cut, because every moment of his glory was a reminder that Sterling no longer had that chance. The Sharpe family didn't talk much about it, but it was precisely that lack of talk that made it last. No conversation to release it, no ritual to close it, just the continuation of life in two opposite directions. Sterling learned to live without being a player, while Shannon was pulled deeper into the NFL world, where everything was measured by performance and endurance. He kept receiving awards, Pro Bowl selections, praise from experts, but every achievement carried the feeling that he was climbing a ladder his brother had been forced to abandon. In the rare evenings when he was alone, Shannon thought about the days the two brothers used to train together, about the time when Sterling was always the one noticed more, and he was the one standing behind. Ironically, when the light finally turned toward him, it illuminated a bigger void than ever. Sterling's career ending made Shannon realize that not everyone who tries gets to finish, and that truth shook his already fragile belief in fairness. He couldn't change what had happened, couldn't share the physical burden with his brother, couldn't give Sterling back the years he lost. The only thing he could do was keep going, but that continuation was never light. Every touchdown he scored, every time the crowd roared, a part of him still listened to the silence from the family, where Sterling was learning to exist outside the field. Shannon Sharpe didn't talk about that guilt to the media because it wasn't an easy story to tell, and it wasn't something the football world wanted to hear. But it was there, threading through every decision, every step, every moment. He wondered whether he was living for himself or carrying the unlived portion of his brother's life. The greatest tragedy in Shannon's life wasn't in the hits or the injuries. It was in having to keep walking the path the two brothers once dreamed of, while his first companion had been forced to stop. And in that continuation, the question I keep living, but do I have the right, never got a clear answer. It just stayed, like a shadow, following him through every season, every title, every moment of glory that was never fully complete. The peak of Shannon Sharpe's career didn't arrive like a surprise. It came as the inevitable conclusion to the years he had worn himself down to survive. When the name Shannon Sharpe was called at the Pro Football Hall of Fame, it was history's final confirmation. He wasn't just an outstanding tight end, he was one of the greatest to ever play the position. The numbers were no longer debatable. The titles needed no justification, and his role in changing how the NFL viewed the tight end had become an unwritten part of the league's curriculum. At that peak, Shannon was no longer the seventh-round pick from years ago, no longer the backup plan. He was the standard. But precisely at the moment the world recognized him the most, the emptiness inside him was clearer than ever. The body that had carried him to that peak had now become a map crisscrossed with the marks of payment. Knees no longer flexible, back aching constantly, random aches appearing without reason, as if the body was replaying every collision he had forced it to take. Glory couldn't erase the truth that every step he took now required more willpower than before. That comfort had become a distant luxury memory. Outside, he was called the greatest tight end in history, but inside, he lived with a worn-out body, a body that had completed its mission and was now demanding rest in a way his willpower couldn't deny. At the same time, When his career reached the point everyone dreams of, Shannon's personal life had no clear shape. No real family of his own to return to after each season. No space where he could shed the warrior role and just be an ordinary person. Relationships that passed through his life often stopped before they could become support because Shannon had never learned how to share his emotional burdens. From Glennville to the NFL, he had been taught that weakness was dangerous, that silence was safe, and that habit followed him all the way to the height of fame. The locker room became the only place where people understood him, where other men also carried invisible scars, where no one needed to explain why they spoke less, or why getting up each morning was slower than the day before. But the locker room didn't last forever, and when the lights went out, when practices ended, Shannon had to face a much larger space, one without a common language to talk about what he was carrying. The Hall of Fame glory gave him immortality in sports history, but it didn't give him someone to share that joy fully. No family laughter echoing in the house, no peaceful moment where success could be set down and only human presence remained. Instead, there were quiet evenings where titles sat still on the shelf, while the body kept reminding him of the price paid. Shannon Sharpe didn't regret reaching the peak, but he began to realize that the peak wasn't a place to stay long. It was like a barren mountaintop, where the wind blew hard and there was no shelter, where you could see everything but had no one standing beside you to see it with. That emptiness didn't explode into clear tragedy. It existed quietly, like a prolonged pause between congratulations. He was called the greatest, but that very greatness made it harder and harder to share the small things, the ordinary fatigue, because the image the world pinned on him left no room for fragility. And so, at the peak of his career, Shannon Sharpe stood there, with everything he had once fought to achieve, but with no one to fully feel that moment with him. Glory had no one left to share it with, and in that silence, he began to understand that there are victories, even those remembered by history, that still carry an undeniable loneliness. The first morning after retirement came to Shannon Sharpe in a way no title could have prepared him for. No more practice schedule taped to the wall, no more team meetings, no more sound of cleats hitting the locker room floor, or a life chopped into practices, games, weeks of proving he belonged. That morning began with absolute silence, and in that silence, his body spoke louder than ever. The pains once masked by adrenaline now rose without mercy, as if the body had waited for exactly this moment to demand everything back. His back stiffened the instant he sat up. His knees reminded him with deep aches. His shoulders weighed heavy like they still carried the memory of thousands of collisions. No more reason to ignore them. No game ahead to convince himself that just a little more endurance would be enough. Shannon Sharpe realized that without adrenaline, pain wasn't just a physical sensation. It became a state of being. Throughout his career, his body had been trained to obey, to run when ordered, to endure when required, to get up even after being knocked down. But now, the body no longer submitted the way it used to. It slowed down, it demanded rest, and sometimes it refused. For someone who had spent his entire life controlling himself with iron discipline, that resistance didn't just hurt, it disoriented. Along with the pain came a nameless fear that began creeping into every day. Not fear of opponents, not fear of the next injury, but fear of being forgotten. In the NFL, everything moves so fast that faces praised yesterday can vanish from conversation after just a few seasons. Shannon had once been the center of attention, once the benchmark for comparison, and now he had to face the prospect that the world would keep moving without needing his presence. That fear wasn't loud. It existed in small moments. When he turned on the TV and heard new names being mentioned, when he realized football stories were being told without any need for him. At the same time came the fear of losing identity. For decades, Shannon Sharpe had been an NFL player, a tight end, a warrior on the field. That title wasn't just a job. It was how he understood himself. When it disappeared, a void opened, and Shannon had to ask who he was when no longer measured by yards, by touchdowns, by game-changing catches. Not everyone is ready to face that question. And for Shannon, it was especially heavy, because he had never allowed himself to exist without being tied to performance. In those early days of retirement, he felt like he was drifting in a space without structure, with no clear short-term goals to hold on to, no coaches or teammates to remind him he was in the right place. And deeper still was the fear that if he no longer had value on the field, did he have any value at all? The NFL had once been the place where he proved he deserved to exist, where he turned pain into proof of his worth. When that door closed, Shannon had to face a different kind of pain, the pain of no longer being tested every week. No one demanded he be better than yesterday. No one waited for him to take the field and do the impossible. For many, retirement is liberation. But for Shannon, it felt like having his only fluent language taken away. The tragedy of an athlete, after the lights go out, isn't that they no longer play. It's that the world no longer asks who they are. Shannon Sharpe didn't collapse under it, but he didn't overcome it easily either. Every day became a new negotiation with his body, with memory, with the fear of being left behind. He had to learn to live at a different pace, slower, quieter, and that required a kind of courage the field had never taught him. With no crowd roars to fill the emptiness, Shannon was forced to listen to himself, and in that listening, he realized the tragedy didn't end when the career closed. It just shifted to a quieter, longer-lasting form, where every morning, without a practice schedule, became a reminder that the man behind the lights now had to find his own reason to get up. After leaving the field, Shannon Sharpe stepped into television not as someone chasing new spotlight, but as someone trying to find his breath again in a world that had changed its language. The studio had no smell of wet grass or metallic collisions, but it had the pressure of lights, of airtime, of questions that demanded instant answers. There, Shannon was Sharpe, arguing without evasion, never yielding to what he saw as shallow points. He spoke fast, spoke straight, spoke with the confidence of someone who had lived where ambiguity had no place. Every argument landed like a carefully calculated play, every rebuttal like a decisive block. Television became his new battlefield, where Shannon continued using what he did best: discipline, preparation, and the ability to see through an opponent's weakness. Debating gave him the familiar feeling of competition, the sense that he was still in a game with clear rules. When he won a point in dialogue, when he forced silence from the other side with reason, Shannon found a new kind of adrenaline, something that let him forget for a moment that his body no longer obeyed like before. But no matter how sharp his words, they couldn't soothe the lingering back pain from his NFL years. When the show ended, when the lights went off and the studio emptied, Shannon left with the same body that had hurt since morning. No argument could ease the stiffness when he sat too long. No on-air win made getting up the next day any easier. Television gave him a voice, but it didn't give him rest. Just like on the field back then, Shannon again chose not to talk about his pain because he was too used to keeping everything under control. In public, he was the image of certainty, the man who always had an answer. But at night, with no audience, the loneliness stood out clearer. Reason couldn't soothe the quiet hours, when the room held only the sound of the clock and circling thoughts. Shannon could debate for hours about strategy, history, fairness, or injustice in sports. But no argument answered why, after everything, he still felt empty. Television brought structure to his post-retirement life, but it also pulled him into a new loop of pressure, where every statement was scrutinized, every opinion could spark controversy. Shannon didn't back down from it, because backing down had never been his instinct, but that toughness came with its own cost. The on-air confrontations, even intellectual ones, still drained emotional energy, still left lingering tension. After every show, Shannon went home with his mind still ringing from debate, but with no one to share the exhaustion. No locker room to shed the role, no teammates to understand the feeling after a tough game. Television gave him a new title, a place in public life, but it couldn't fill the void the field left behind. Shannon kept speaking, kept analyzing, kept holding the uncompromising image, because that was the only way he knew to survive in a world that always demanded clarity. Yet every time night fell, when the day's noise faded, he still had to face himself with an aching body and thoughts with no opponent to argue against. Words could defeat others, but they couldn't defeat the creeping loneliness when everything grew quiet. Shannon Sharpe had found a way to speak for his pain, to turn sharpness into a new tool for survival. But deep down, he understood this was only a shift, not a solution. Television kept him present, kept him valued in the world's eyes, but it didn't heal the old wounds or create a refuge for the long nights. And so, Shannon stepped into another chapter of his life, where he still had to fight not with his body on the field anymore, but with words in front of the camera, while the old pains quietly followed him home, reminding him that some battles can't be won with reason alone. After all the on-air debates, after the days lived under lights and with sharp words, Shannon Sharpe returned to a private life so quiet that many didn't even realize it existed. No marriage to mark the milestones, no home built in the familiar mold society expects, no long love story retold as part of his legacy. The relationships that passed through his life usually ended in silence, not loud, not dramatically broken, just a steady drifting away like the tide receding when the pull is gone. Shannon wasn't someone who didn't know how to love, but he was someone who didn't know how to stay. Affection for him always carried an invisible boundary, a carefully maintained distance like a layer of armor, because deep down, he feared what he couldn't control. Emotional dependence was something Shannon learned to avoid early on, when childhood taught him that relying on someone could lead to disappointment, and expectations were often the shortest path to hurt. Intimate relationships therefore became triggers for a deep-seated anxiety. If he let someone get too close, would he lose the self-mastery he had paid such a high price to gain? For Shannon, control wasn't about power. It was a survival mechanism. On the field, control helped him survive the hits. In life, control helped him avoid repeating the voids he grew up with. When he thought of family, Shannon didn't see the warm picture many others dream of. He saw silence, exhaustion, and unnamed distances. That's why he chose not to build a family in the traditional sense, not because he lacked the capacity, but because he feared he would unintentionally recreate the old cycle where love existed but wasn't spoken, where closeness always came with tension. Children were one of the rare parts of Shannon's private life that he spoke about with clear tenderness. He loved his kids, loved in a quiet and fiercely protective way, but also loved from a distance, keeping them out of reach of the lights and pressures he had spent his whole life fighting. That distance wasn't indifference. It was a conscious choice, a way to not pull his children into a world where everything was scrutinized and judged. Yet that very choice carried a sadness that wasn't easy to name. Loving from afar meant accepting moments not witnessed, experiences not fully shared. Shannon understood that, but he still chose it, because to him, protecting his kids from the hurts he had endured mattered more than being close. Those evenings after the TV show, when the house grew too quiet, Shannon faced the consequences of those choices. No life partner to talk to, no family laughter to soften the long day, just wide space and circling thoughts. Loneliness in this case didn't arrive like an unexpected accident. It was the result of many small decisions made for logical reasons, but adding up to a life lacking deep connection. Shannon didn't complain about it, because he believed every choice had its own price, and he was used to paying, but being used to it didn't make it light. Some nights, he realized that the absolute self-control he guarded was also the wall keeping him from the comfort every human needs. Shannon's root fear wasn't abandonment. It was losing control, the feeling of becoming dependent on something outside his personal discipline. He had spent his life proving he could stand alone, that he didn't need anyone to save him, and that belief helped him survive. But it also took away the ability to let go. In relationships, letting go meant trust, and trust meant risk. Shannon wasn't sure he could take more of. So he kept the distance, not from lack of feeling, but from fear of what letting emotions lead would bring. Loneliness, in Shannon Sharpe's case, wasn't something that happened against his will. It was a defensive choice, built layer by layer, year by year, to protect a person who had taken enough hits, both physical and emotional. But like any armor, it both protected and isolated. Shannon understood that, and sometimes that very understanding made the silence heavier. He had learned to live with it, just as he had learned to live with the pain in his body. But that didn't make it disappear. It just became part of his life, quiet, persistent, reminding him that some wounds aren't on the skin, and some voids are created not from lack of effort, but from too much fear hidden for too long. As Shannon Sharpe stepped deeper into the mainstream media space, he quickly realized this arena was just as ruthless as the field, only the collisions didn't leave bruises on the skin. They left cracks in image and relationships. Shannon's statements grew sharper, more direct, and unsoftened by the pleasantness television usually favored. He didn't speak to please, didn't adjust his views for safety, and certainly didn't avoid topics that made others uncomfortable. For Shannon, truth always mattered more than the audience's or colleagues' comfort. But that choice pushed him into the center of controversy. Every time he spoke about players, about the system, about injustice or double standards in sports, the reaction wasn't just agreement or professional disagreement. It was stark polarization. People loved him for his candor. Others turned away because they thought he was too harsh, too extreme, too uncomfortable to stick with long term. The space for dialogue gradually became a place where every word was scrutinized, not for its content value, but for the emotion it triggered. In that context, Shannon's working relationship at Undisputed began to fracture. The show that once gave him a central position, a stage to say what he thought, now became a place of mounting pressure. The disagreements were no longer about debate tactics, but about the philosophy of existing on air. Did television need brutal honesty, even if it made people uncomfortable? Or did it need softness to keep viewers around? When Shannon left Undisputed, there was no clear victory or defeat statement, just the familiar silence that had followed him from Glennville, through Savannah State, through the NFL, and now returned in another form. The media quickly slapped simple labels on him. Difficult to work with, too blunt, doesn't know how to adjust. Those labels spread easily because they were convenient explanations for an exit no one wanted to dig into. For Shannon, it wasn't the first time he was misunderstood, but it was the first time the isolation played out so publicly. He no longer stood in a lineup or a crew where people had to rely on each other to win. Instead, he stood alone in the court of public opinion, where support and criticism came from people who didn't really know who he was. The feeling of not being liked wasn't new to Shannon Sharpe, but at this stage of life, it carried a different shade. On the field, being hated was a sign you were doing your job well. On television, being hated was often seen as failure to build an image. Shannon understood that, but he didn't choose to change. Better to be hated than to lie, that wasn't a slogan. It was a conclusion drawn from a lifetime in unforgiving systems. He had once lied to his body to take the field, once stayed silent through pain to keep his spot, and he knew the cost of betraying truth. So, when faced with the choice between adjusting to be liked and staying true to himself, Shannon chose the familiar path. Accept the isolation. That decision didn't bring relief. There were days he realized his bluntness had pushed away opportunities, relationships that could have made life easier. Some evenings, Looking back at the harsh reactions on social media, he felt tired in a way different from physical exhaustion. But tiredness didn't mean regret. Shannon Sharpe didn't seek universal affection because he understood too well that public love usually came with conditions. Today, they cheer you for saying what they want to hear. Tomorrow, they turn away when you break that expectation. He had lived long enough to know easy affection was often the easiest to lose. Isolation, in this case, wasn't a punishment the world imposed. It was the consequence of a conscious choice. Shannon accepted standing outside the safe circle to keep the one thing he still trusted: honesty with himself. Not being loved didn't mean being worthless, but it demanded a mental endurance not everyone had. For Shannon, it was just another form of the fight he was familiar with. From a seventh-round pick to the Hall of Fame peak, from locker room to studio, he had always been willing to pay the price to not pretend. And in this phase, when labels like difficult or divisive got stuck to his name, Shannon Sharpe didn't try to peel them off. He left them there, as part of the story, because in the end, what he feared most wasn't being hated. It was losing his own voice in a world that always encouraged easy compromise. At age 57, Shannon Sharpe didn't arrive with a sudden shock, but with a persistent, repeating erosion that no longer had a clear starting point. No single big tragedy to name. No collapse moment for the media to latch onto, just mornings waking up to chronic pain that was already there before consciousness fully arrived. His back stiffened like a cold steel block. His knee joints reminded him with small creaks. His neck and shoulders weighed heavy, as if carrying the memory of thousands of collisions. Pain was no longer a warning signal. It became the background hum of life, so constant that if it ever went away for a day, Shannon might feel more uneasy than relieved. He had grown used to measuring time not by the calendar, but by how comfortable his body felt, how long it took to get up today, how many minutes his back needed before it would move, whether the pain came early or late today. Along with the pain came a quiet worry about memory, a worry not loud but persistent. Shannon had lived in a sport where the head wasn't just for thinking, it was for enduring. He remembered so many games, remembered decisive plays, remembered the feeling of victory, but small gaps were starting to appear, details fading like old photographs losing color. He wondered if it was just age, or the price of years spent trading too much. The fear wasn't forgetting someone's name. It was the possibility that one day he might no longer recognize himself, no longer hold the continuous thread of his own life story. For someone who had spent his entire life building identity through discipline and memory of what he had overcome, that thought was more terrifying than any injury. Shannon didn't talk much about it, because he knew the world had little patience for worries without clear conclusions. He chose to manage it quietly, the same way he had once managed physical pain. Train just enough to keep the body moving. Read, and learn to keep the mind sharp. Maintain routines like anchors to keep from drifting. But even discipline had limits, and he was acutely aware of his greatest fear: the day his body no longer obeyed. Not the inability to run fast, but the inability to stand up on command, to decide his own rhythm of life. For Shannon, self-mastery was the foundation of dignity. Losing it meant being pushed back to the helplessness he had sworn never to return to. Age 57, therefore, wasn't a time for romantic nostalgia. It was a period of silent calculations: how much he could do today, what to cut back tomorrow, which limits not to cross. No big tragedy, just accumulated fatigue, like water dripping on stone, not breaking it immediately but never stopping. Memory weighed in a similar way. Everything Shannon had lived through didn't vanish when his career ended. It stayed in every reflex, every emotional response. He still heard crowd roars in short dreams, still felt his heart race during tense arguments, as if the body had never truly left the field. But mixed with those memories were questions without answers. Was it all worth it? Was there a less erosive path? He didn't regret, but he didn't romanticize the past either. Shannon understood that the road he chose had brought him here, with everything that came along, and searching for a neatly rounded ending was unrealistic. Age 57 taught him to accept what wouldn't heal, not through surrender, but through honesty. Some pains won't go away, they can only be managed. Some fears won't be erased, they can only be named so they no longer control him from the shadows. Some losses have no closing ritual, they can only be carried as part of who he is. Shannon Sharpe lived in this phase with rare clarity. No seeking miracles, no waiting for salvation. He knew the body would keep eroding, memory would keep weighing, and time would show no mercy. But he also knew that standing firm no longer depended on muscle strength, but on the ability to accept reality without losing dignity. Age 57, with all its limits, became another test no less brutal than what he had faced before. No final whistle, no scoreboard to confirm victory, just a man learning to live with what wouldn't heal day by day, slowly but without retreating. The end of this story doesn't open with redemption, nor does it close with a personal triumph like the scripts America often wants to believe. At this age, Shannon Sharpe isn't standing on any stage waiting for more applause, nor expecting a turnaround moment where every crack gets sealed. He stands there, quietly, with everything left after a life that has spent nearly every resource. Not fully healed, because some wounds weren't made to be healed. No personal victory, because some fights have no rules, no scoreboard, and no fair audience. No complete peace, because peace requires a letting go that Shannon was never taught how to do. The only thing remaining isn't medals, isn't titles, it's the rare honesty with himself. Shannon Sharpe no longer tries to appear as strong as before, but he also doesn't allow himself to collapse. His endurance now isn't loud or showy, it exists in every small choice. Getting up despite the pain, speaking truth, even knowing he'll be hated, continuing to show up even knowing the world doesn't need him the way it once did. This isn't the heroization of pain, it's a minimalist form of existence, where the man simply tries to keep himself from falling below the line of self-respect. No one came to save him, and perhaps no one ever truly did. From poor Glennville, from the invisible years at Savannah State, from the 7th-round pick no one expected, Shannon understood early that salvation wasn't reserved for people like him. The NFL didn't save him. It only used him until his body no longer complied. Television didn't save him. It only amplified his voice until that voice became inconvenient. The public didn't save him. They only loved or hated the version they needed at each moment. Even family, though the place he loved most deeply, wasn't a perfect refuge. Shannon Sharpe grew up and matured in a world where every relationship came with conditions, and he learned to survive by not expecting too much. So looking back, his tragedy wasn't in one moment of collapse. It was in the prolongation. It didn't explode and end. It smoldered, persistent, threading into every phase of life, changing shape, but never disappearing. He didn't overcome his childhood tragedy. He carried it. He didn't overcome his brother's shadow. He learned to live beside it. He didn't overcome the erosion of his body. He adjusted his life around it. He didn't overcome loneliness. He arranged his life to endure it in order. Here, there are no miracles, no moment of enlightenment that makes everything lighter. Just a man who still stands, though very tired, because standing is the only thing he still knows how to do. That tiredness doesn't make him weaker in his own eyes. It only makes him more honest. Shannon Sharpe no longer seeks to prove his worth, because he paid that price long ago. He also no longer seeks to be loved, because he understands crowd love is always fragile. What he keeps is the ability to look straight in the mirror without lying, the ability to admit he has endured too much, and the ability to keep living without needing to add any romantic meaning. America's Stars doesn't tell this story to turn Shannon Sharpe into a perfect icon, but to show the real cost of becoming one. Behind the historical numbers and Hall of Fame titles is a man who wasn't saved, wasn't soothed in time, wasn't taught how to rest. And perhaps that's exactly what makes him worthy of respect in a different way. Not because he won everything, but because he didn't run from what he lived through. This story doesn't close with bright hope. It closes with raw truth. Shannon Sharpe didn't overcome tragedy. He only learned to keep living with it every day, slowly, heavily, but still standing. The story of Shannon Sharpe leaves a lingering sadness, not explosive, but prolonged, because it doesn't tell of a single tragedy, but of an entire life eroded bit by bit. The most heartbreaking part isn't that he was born poor in Glennville or overlooked at Savannah State. It's how that invisibility followed him his whole life, even when he stood at the Hall of Fame peak. Being picked in the 7th round of the NFL draft, then having to turn his body into a tool to prove his worth with the Denver Broncos, reveals a harsh American reality. Not everyone gets a fair shot, and many have to pay with their own health to be recognized. When Sterling Sharpe was forced to stop because of a neck injury, while Shannon kept playing and receiving glory, that quiet guilt reflected a very human tragedy. Survival doesn't always come with relief. At the peak of his career, when called the greatest tight end in history, Shannon had no family of his own to share it with. The locker room was the only place that truly understood. After retirement, chronic pain, fear of being forgotten, and loss of identity showed the real cost of athletic glory that American society often romanticizes. His move into television with a sharp voice, accepting being hated over lying, and leaving undisputed in isolation only deepened the image of a man who chose honesty over comfort. The lesson for Americans isn't to become tougher, it's to learn to look straight at the price of success. This story reminds us that discipline and endurance can take a person very far. But if society only celebrates victory while ignoring the person behind it, the tragedy doesn't end when the applause stops. Shannon Sharpe is honored not because he was perfect, but because he represents a hard-to-accept truth. Some people aren't saved, but they still deserve to be understood and valued. If Shannon Sharpe's story has made you reflect on the real cost of success and the silent endurance behind the spotlight, please subscribe to the channel to keep following these portraits of imperfect but very real people. Thank you for listening to the very end, and see you in the next video where we continue to look deeper into the lives that seem legendary but are full of cracks in America.